Rita, I'm just going to make you a co-host if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right. And you can let the people in if you don't mind as they come. All right. Javier Zamora was born in El Salvador in 1990. His father fled the country when he was 1, and his mother when he was about to turn 5. Both parents' migrations were caused by the US-funded Salvadorian Civil War. When he was 9, Javier migrated through Guatemala, Mexico, and the Sonoran Desert. His debut poetry collection, Unaccompanied, explores the impact of the war and immigration on his family. Zamora has been a Stegner Fellow at Stanford and a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard and holds fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Poetry Foundation. Pretty impressive. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Like I said previously, we've all read Solito, really impactful and beautiful book. We do have some questions. If anybody wants to ask their questions live, then we encourage you to do so. We love people to get interactive and engage. So please do. But if you don't and you want to ask a question, then by all means you can use the chat window and I will make sure that it gets asked. If I can find the chat window. Here we go. All right. We're on it. All right, but I do have some questions. I mean, actually, we've been emailed. People have been emailing me all week with questions, so that's really nice. So I've sent over some, but there's more. So the book was actually released in 2022. How has that journey been since its release, and what has the reception been like?
Oh, first, thank you for the invitation. Canada was actually the first country that I went to when I got a green card.
Yeah,
So this is
amazing.
cool. It was the day that weed was legalized in Vancouver.
There you go. Good choice.
And the reception has been wild. I think I did a lot of preparation with my therapist about what having a very personal story out in the world would feel like. And the metaphor that we came up with is like the book is a kid, your kid, that you put into the New York City subway. And then you stay on the platform and the kid is on the subway. Then you don't know where or when they're going to get off. And I still get DMs from strangers. People show up to my readings even almost 2 years after. So I've been very fortunate that people have helped and liked that kid inside of the subway. But it's still almost I don't know. I still can't really like take all the credit. It just doesn't feel like it's completely a part of me anymore. The reception, the book is a part of me. So it's just strange. I'm still navigating it. Yeah.
That's amazing. And so nice that it has such good reception. And this wasn't going to be my next question, but I mean, we actually ask most authors this because it's such a divide, but do you read your review?
I do not.
Yeah.
I began to at the like first week that it came out, and my wife quickly changed the password so I wouldn't. And she's the one who like sifts through them. If there's a really good one, she tells me about it. But we've stopped doing that.
Well, your wife
because
is a smart woman.
yeah, because I didn't I hadn't met my wife when I had published my book of poems, and for that one it was rough. I would go through my what people would say about my poetry book, and it really got to me. So I've learned a hard lesson.
For sure, especially since it's such a personal thing. Like you can write a nonfiction or you can write a fiction book and sort of put it out there, but like this is your life story and people are commenting on that. And that must be like a whole nother level of terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. Or for this book, the one comment that saw the first week that it came out, people began to blame my parents, which is not something that I would want a reader to do at all. So that's why the passwords were changed.
Well, I'm happy to report that your Goodread ratings are incredibly high.
Yeah, great, thank you.
All right. So we have just a comment here actually, and it's from Anna, and she says she doesn't have a specific question, but she just wants to show up to thank you for writing this book.
No, thank you, Anna.
For all of those that have joined us since I did my little blurb, if you do have a question, please, I mean, this is the this is the burning question here. Have you heard from anyone you traveled with?
I have not. I think I mentioned it in the book that parents heard from Marcelo immediately after he made it to LA. And outside of the book, I didn't want to include this, but he hasn't had the best of lives in the United States. So I do know what happened to him.
Mhm.
I don't know what happened to none of the others have ever reached out. Um, so I don't know. I'm still hopeful. If there's anybody that would come across my book, I think it would be Carla. I'm 34, she would be 37, 38, maybe. So social media, I'm hoping that social media puts the book in her sphere. But I'm also aware that the person who wrote the book didn't want to think about them and couldn't think about them for 20 years, until I decided to go to therapy and approach this head on. So if they are alive, if they are in the United States or El Salvador, and if they know that the book exists, I completely understand why they wouldn't come forward.
Well, and I mean, this is all you can do, right?
Yeah, yeah. I have gotten a lot of offers of people who call themselves headhunters, which I didn't know,
Right.
and journalists to find them pro bono, but I don't.
No,
I wouldn't want to re-traumatize them.
you want it to be organic if it happens.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
respect for sure. All right. So what I love most about the book was was your ability to hyper focus on what a 9-year-old would actually be thinking about this entire experience. Was that difficult after so long to include like those really important specific memories?
Yes and no. Um, from a literary point of view, um, it was like an exercise. I guess actually it was like a therapeutic exercise to put myself in my own shoes. Um, I remembered, perhaps it might be surprising to if you haven't gone through like crossing the border, but my brain chose to really remember all the details of the most traumatic experiences. So those experiences were really easy in a weird way to write out of me because I always remember them.
Mhm.
What was actually harder to do was recreate boredom as a 9-year-old. I'm talking specifically about the chapter in Guadalajara or instances when we're just waiting or not doing anything. Those For those I did have to really try and fail to get in my own mindset. But for the other aspects, the 9-year-old, if we want to use the metaphor of a film, he knew how to direct it because the directions are still in here. The smells are there, little quirks, little things, where to point the camera. Um, he knows how to do it.
Wow. Darlene just here asks, and this was another question that came up in book club last night. She said, I love the inclusion of Spanish in the book. Some of my chapter's members who don't speak Spanish struggled with it though. Can you talk about the decision to include that and not include the translations?
Um, you know, in the United States, which I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, um, Salvadorans are the second largest immigrant group. You know, only Mexicans are bigger than us. We have an astronaut who has been in space the longest. He's Salvadoran American. We have pupusas in Trader Joe's. I don't know if you guys have Trader Joe's and Whole Foods.
Yes.
If you guys know Saturday Night Live, one of their main writers is Salvadoran. Like wherever you look, we are everywhere.
Mhm.
And so for me, it's not only including in Spanish, but the type of Spanish that I include, and that is Salvadoran Spanish, that I think the Salvadoran population, including myself, especially myself, has been yearning for a book that not only has Spanish, but has our Spanish.
Mm.
And so it was very important for me, especially in 2022, 2024, when we have the internet. We all have one of these that if you don't know what a word means, you can quickly Google it. Or ask in the United States, depending on what city you're in, you probably have a Salvadoran friend that you can be like, hey, what does this mean? Which I am aware that in Canada and in other countries, it has been um, harder to get the reception. But weirdly, not in Catalonia. My book came out in Catalan, and the Catalans in Barcelona, like they get it because they have to. I think they're aware of code switching because they're part of Spain, but they speak Catalan.
Mm.
And so it's been very interesting to see where and in what countries. Hungary didn't do well. In India, it's done well, and in the Netherlands. Um, so it's interesting for me, like from the outside, to see.
So excuse my ignorance, but the Catalan is the dialect similar, or is that?
Uh, to Spanish,
Yes.
it's quite different.
Yeah.
It's like a weird mixture of, and they got mad when I compared them to Italian.
Okay.
They like them think of themselves as more French, but it's like a mixture of Spain, French, and Italian.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Somebody
Um,
mentioned in the comments.
yeah, there's so many, I can't keep track. I do see your question, Farah, and we will ask that in 1 second. But Gabriella asks, and this I thought was an interesting question, but what was the turning point for you to decide to write a book about your experience?
Did I? Excuse me. I was reading the
Uh,
messages.
like what happened in your life that like sort of like you hit a point where you're like, okay, I'm gonna write about my life. I mean, you did before so in your poetry.
I did and I didn't. Um, the poetry, and this is only my experience. I'm not. Um, I got to a point that I thought that writing was my therapy,
Mhm.
and that all I needed to do to heal was to write about it. I didn't need a professional to be helping me. I didn't need anybody else, just the writing. And that can only take you so far. At least it only took me so far. Um, the book of poems is 88 pages.
Mhm.
In all of the 88 pages, Chino is the only person of member of the four or the six that ever appears in my poetry. And he's only in 2 pages, two out of 88. I think that's very telling of
Mm.
where I was in my mental space of diving deeper into this story that I needed to tell. And the book comes out in 2017, my poetry book. It is that presidency. When I'm hearing a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, um, and I realize as I'm going from university bookstore to bookstore reading my poetry that I'm not doing the work, like the actual work of healing. And I get to a very unhealthy point in my life. I finally get a green card. I'm at Harvard. I have my own office, but I'm so unhappy. And I think that I'm just hitting like my head against the wall, and I'm like, something has to change, and that something becomes therapy. I meet my therapist. I meet my now wife. I start believing in this thing called Reiki. I start doing yoga, meditating. Um, I become vegan for a quick minute. I become a verter. So I really attempt and try all of the things to heal and to that things that I know or I hope will help me get to a place where I can get this story out of me.
Did you feel like in your journey that like, okay, you got your green card, you went to Harvard, like did you feel like there's this checklist that you were checking off to like where you would be like you would feel whole, perhaps.
Yes. Not only that, I realized that that checklist is something that I had internalized
Mm.
as an immigrant in the United States. I realized that I'm trying to convince not myself, but this idealized, or I don't even know, this toxic American, uh, that I'm trying to convince them. And you can like substitute the president of the United States at that time or any time,
Yeah.
that I matter and that
Right.
I deserve to be in this country. And look at all the accolades that I've gotten. Why can't you treat me like a complete human being? But then in that, I realized that it's not an outsider who I have to convince. It is myself. And it took I have the privilege to say that it took me all those accolades to realize it, which I am aware that I'm very fortunate to have even gotten there.
Right.
But now, after having getting those things, I can genuinely say that those things don't matter, or they didn't matter to me. What actually did matter was looking at my trauma in the face and realizing that the 9 year old also deserves love, and that 9 year old is just as human as anybody else.
So what are you prouder of? Are you prouder of the having done the book, or or have done the work? Or are they like sort of tied completely together?
It's interesting because I'm attempting to write another book,
Mhm.
and what I still meet with my therapist every Wednesday, and it seems that I have conflated the two,
Right.
because this book helped me so much in my actual life. Like, I'm not talking about literary, just life, that I want to replicate that same feeling for my next book.
Right.
Meaning that this is not the only trauma, that I've experienced. Being an undocumented immigrant in this country has been its own form of trauma. And so I'm trying to address those years from fourth grade to eighth grade in therapy, and hoping that the formula works again. But my therapist keeps reminding me that this is gonna be its own process. You can't replicate the same thing twice. So
But how wonderful. I mean, your book spoke to so many people who went through something similar to you, and a lot of people who didn't. And now you're going to write about an experience that so many people are facing every single day. So that's incredible.
yeah, hopefully I do it. It's
We
harder
hope you do it.
than the first one.
And I am sorry, I will go back to the questions because I went down a bit of my own rabbit hole there. All right. So Farah asks, how did you balance the therapeutic impact of writing your story with the re-traumatization? And we kind of covered that a little bit.
It wasn't as, I guess in hindsight, everything doesn't seem as re-traumatizing, but now I'm remembering that, moving to the desert and Tucson, the place where I finished the journey, that's where we live now. Moving here was difficult. But I think it's something that I needed to do, and something that I couldn't have done without my wife, or all the people that my therapist and the support of my family as well. My family has never told me not to write anything. I've always, and I know that I'm also very fortunate. Not a lot of immigrant parents would just tell you to air your dirty laundry, but my parents have never minded it. So yeah, I don't know. It wasn't as difficult as pretending that everything was fine for 20 years. Um,
Um, was there a point in was there any point in this difficult journey where you wanted to quit the trip and come back to El Salvador?
no, not at all. And I don't know. I think I have to believe, for a long time, part of my healing was recognizing that I wasn't making it up. I think a lot of survivors of any trauma, we like to call ourselves like a faulty narrator, or like, oh, you're just making that up. It couldn't have happened that way. And moving to the desert, realizing that my visions and my PTSD looked like the actual real world, and that and not only accepting that, but accepting also that deep down, this little kid, I remember never wanting to go back. He was just so hopeful all the fucking time. And I didn't believe that. And my therapist keeps telling me that is your superpower. Like that was what you provided, not only to yourself, but the group. Because there's a theory, and I always forget the name in therapy, that we externalize different parts. So if you're in a group dynamic, each individual takes out that role. So Chino was the fighter or like the protector, and so was Patricia. Carla was like the comedic relief or the soother of everybody else, and I guess I was the blind hope. I was the keeper of the hope for everybody. When all the adults around me felt like giving up, this little boy, this naive little boy, was like, "No, we can do it." And that was the role that was given to me. And try and accepting as an adult that I also contributed something to this group was very difficult for me to accept. And it's still something very difficult because to me, I'm like, oh, I'm only here because of them. But my therapist likes to remind me, oh no, you're here because of all of you.
Yeah. I just wonder, and you might not know the answer to this, but at that time, like, what were the odds of getting across safely?
No, um, it's is it interesting that you asked that because in 1999, Homeland Security, or it used to be called INS, they started keeping track of people that died in the desert. Like they began to keep track in 1999, and I think the figure that year was like 1,300 people dead, which is higher now. Um, so, and a lot of journalists like to look at the recent years, which now that 2022, 2023 have been the biggest influx of immigrants coming over the border, but everybody like to think that 2016 was. Actually 1999 and to 2001 was a much higher surge than the 2016 one. And that's when I came over. So I don't know. I don't think even INS or the government knows those odds because they started to keep it track in 1999.
They just seem so convinced that like there'd be no trouble at the beginning, and you had to try 3 times before you
Mm-hmm.
actually. And they told you that they were going to arrest you when you got when they caught you the first time. But do they arrest you, or were they just sending everybody back?
They, I think, um, the second time or the first time they did.
Yeah,
Like
they arrested
I
you
was.
and they held you, but then they
Mhm.
released you. But then they were like, you're going to be in jail for like 3 months or something, right? Like that was there was like they said something that was a deterrent for you not to try again.
So that was also changing policies. Now
Right.
we're talking about, so Clinton made it change the law in 1996.
Mhm.
So there would be a penalty of 10 years for each entry.
Right.
When I came in, it was still illegal to hold a minor for longer than 72 hours. Obama changed that law that eventually gave us family separation.
Mhm.
So to this day, kids are technically, again, outside of family separation, they're not in detention longer than 72 hours. But the United States government has created this other thing that looks a lot like detention, but they're not calling it detention
Right.
because it's just children in other things that they like to call foster care or different facilities that are only for teens and children. But I would call that still incarceration. And and for me, the hardest, the most difficult thing to access inside of my trauma were those 72 hours in detention.
Right.
I only suffered 72 detentions and it has affected me for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
It will continue to affect me for the rest of my life. I can't imagine what these children are going through now who are in jail or not jail for more than 72 hours. And again, that's how Americans are treating brown and black children. Yeah.
Agnes asks, how did the rest of your family receive your book? Did they discover anything in it about your experience that you did not share with them before?
Uh, my mom is in therapy and still hasn't gone past chapter 2. I think it's very difficult for her to know exactly because they both heard me right after I did it, and I talk about this at the end of the book. Like they just kept asking questions, and I kept on giving them answers, and because of how I was giving those answers, it was difficult for them to ask me again because as parents they couldn't believe that their 9-year-old was saying the stuff that he was saying, like, oh yeah, we got chased by a helicopter, oh yeah, we were in the ocean, have you been in the ocean for 25 hours? Like they were just, and I remember them just like crying. So they know, kind of, but my mom still doesn't know what it felt like to be in my shoes because that is like what I recreated in this book. My dad is not in therapy and he read it, and I think he read it with his brain, not so much his heart. But he's a crier, so he cried at the end. My grandpa hasn't gone past chapter 2 either. I think because he knows up to chapter 2. He was there with me up until he leaves me, and he still, or at least he hasn't told me that he has read past it. My grandma is beginning to read it as well. I don't know where she is in the process, but yeah.
I loved your grandfather.
It's a complicated figure.
Yeah, complicated, but like, yeah, just your relationship, how much it formed on your journey was just so beautiful.
Mhm.
Um, so the book is difficult in a lot of ways to read, yet there were lots of moments of beauty and happiness as well as difficulty. I think you captured the human condition so well and loved your found family so much. Can you speak a little bit more about sort of like the impact and sort of like the beauty of the experience as opposed to sort of like, because it was traumatic, of course it was traumatic, but I do think that you spent a lot of time sort of like looking at the silver lining.
Yeah, the most annoying thing when you're trying to heal from something is hearing non-survivors write about that exact same thing and getting it wrong.
Right.
And that is what most writers who write about immigration
Mhm.
have failed to do. All they do is focus on how hard it is or how traumatic it is to come over the border. You get images of like children on the beast or like dying of thirst, which, yeah, that occurs. But if you've lived it, if you've been in it, you also understand that you have to trick your mind into finding moments of joy. Because if you don't find moments of joy, you're trapped. You're for lack of a better term, you're fucked. You're frozen and you can't move. You have to create motion by, this is really bad or this is really bad. But hey, look at this frying fish. It's really good, isn't it? And then, oh, we're taking out of a bus again. Oh, but look, let's have fart wars and like create like some comedic relief. And that's how immigrants survive. And so it was very important for me to balance it out. And if you come to the Sonoran Desert, outside of like the food and the joyful parts, this place is beautiful. And when you come and visit, it is still so like it doesn't make sense that people are dying in
Yeah.
such a beautiful place.
Right.
And capturing and being in a place mentally where I can capture the beauty, but then also show you the hurt.
Mm.
I think that is reality, and that is also art. Um, because if you only capture the negative, that is journalism,
Right.
and in my opinion, really bad journalism.
Mhm.
Um, so we need something else.
Jody asks, how did it feel to finally be reunited with your parents? Were you able to get back into your life, or did it take a time after such a journey?
That's for book two. It's complicated. It was the United States is not what everybody makes it out to be. And especially as a kid, what I thought the United States was, Baywatch, Full House, 90210, all the shows that we watch on TV. And that's what I was expecting. Nobody ever told me that being an undocumented immigrant, and that's what my parents were, my mom still is, that is like being a second-class citizen.
Right.
And it took me so long to not be affected by the treatment from the US government towards my family. So I was angry. And so this next book is going to be angrier. Um, and it's going to be, again, I don't want it to be completely sad, because not my life hasn't been completely sad in the United States. It's also been beautiful. So yeah, it's been complicated. And also, I didn't know my dad. My dad left me when I was 1. I didn't remember him.
Mhm.
So I had a period of not trusting him, and for him being a stranger, especially the men in my life had been absent and complicated, like my grandpa. And then the men that I encountered along the way, they were in uniform and pointed guns at me. And now I have to live with this man who is my dad, and I have to learn to trust him, which is something that, weirdly, yesterday in therapy, we're beginning to talk about my dad. For 4 years of therapy, we've been talking about mom, but now realizing how, his absence and my relationship with him has affected me, and my relationship with other men. I think as a 34-year-old man, I'm still more comfortable around women, because I grew up with women, and like seeing men in a weird way reminds me of, um, especially white men, of men in uniform, because those were the first white people that I ever encountered, white men. So I don't know. It's all been complicated.
Mara here just says, she has a comment. As a Central American immigrant, she's from Honduras. This book was so special to me. I appreciate reading literature about Central America versus Mexico. I had some great conversations with my book club about the cultural differences and language differences. Also, I loved all the talk about Salvadoran food.
Gracias, Katacha.
Gabriella says, I would love to read a book following your life story from after you arrived in the US. And lots of Me Too's.
Me too.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to write it, but yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Oh, Juanita wants to know if your parents' experience was relatively easy when they crossed.
You know, great question, because they don't talk about it. I think the real trick here, or that I'm trying to accept that I've done, is like really spill the beans, about a experience that most people that have survived it never get to a place to reveal it. And a lot of people that show up to my readings are children of immigrants and or immigrants, but I think it's mostly children of immigrants who thank me, and they say something along the lines of, reading your book has allowed me to kind of piece my parents' journey together, because they never talk about it. And there's this silence. And I think that silence is silence because of shame. And so there's a lot of shame about what we do, because it's still in 2024, and every presidential elections, every candidate makes us feel shameful, yeah, for having done what we did. And so until that shame changes, it's going to be harder to hear stories like mine, because I for some reason, I like rigged the system and found the right, absolute right therapist that could get me to this place. But our parents, the average immigrant, doesn't have access to that. And my parents are certainly two of those immigrants who still haven't told me, the writer of a book like this, they still haven't told me what they went through. I get snippets. I know that my mom is really afraid of heights. There's a beautiful, I don't know if you guys know Sedona, but it's like this beautiful place in northern Arizona. And I took my mom there because she wanted to go. And we're up midway through this hike that wasn't even that, arduous. It wasn't even that steep, but she just freezes and she can't move. And she had to like sit there and wait for us to go to the top and come back because she wanted us to go to the top. And then I'm piecing two and two together, and this landscape looks like the landscape where she crossed the border. And she doesn't tell me this. And I think this is like what the children of people who have gone through something like that, this is the formulas and the mathematics that we have to do, because they won't talk about it. Yeah. That's a whole rant about.
I thought about your parents a lot when I was reading the book. I have two small children, and when they didn't hear anything for 6 weeks, I just can't even imagine the ride they were on. It'd be so
And that's
tough.
another trauma, which I
Yeah,
think would
absolutely.
keep them from even talking about their own trauma,
Yeah.
because they put me through this and they still feel so much guilt around it to this day. So it wasn't supposed to happen like this.
Gina asks if you can describe yeah, you've been back to El Salvador and seeing your grandparents again. If you can just describe that.
I think going back to my country after 19 years of not having been in it, I finally realized that I'm not from there either. I think when you don't have the privilege of returning to a land, you idealize that land. And I think being there, I realized that I had idealized my childhood, not my country, but my childhood. And it is my childhood that I miss, not my country. My country has changed a lot. And I don't feel that the way that I think, the way that I view the world is allowed to exist in my country. And that is precisely the reason why people are still immigrating. But outside of that, seeing my family, seeing my grandma for the first time was also difficult, because everybody that she has loved has left her and they haven't come back. And so I was the first individual to go back, and she couldn't hug me fully. The first, second, third, I think it took my fourth time for her to really trust me. I think trust is perhaps the most important thing around immigration. I talk about trusting men and trusting individuals in uniforms. That's something that I still is a byproduct of immigration. For my grandma, or those that are left behind, they have to learn to trust the family members that have left and that they truly don't know anymore. As a 28-year-old man, I am not that 9-year-old kid that she remembers. Yeah. And like, you can call somebody once a week or as much as you can, but it's not the same thing. So it was difficult, but now it's better. And they're both, my grandpa's still burning trash, every day. And they're wonderful beings.
And your grandfather was actually able to come and visit you in the States.
Yeah, so he had a tourist visa for a while. So he came and visited 3 times. Yeah.
I don't actually know what Darlene is talking about. I don't know what this is, but I will read it. Can you tell us more about the straw incident? I related to that one specifically as a non-native Spanish speaker who travels, and there's a different word for that in many different countries. I never considered that Mexican restaurants would turn in immigrants. That wasn't even in my consciousness. So I was so surprised by how you all had to not talk for fear of this issue. Can you add anything about that and the straw?
So the straw incident is that I say the wrong word for straw,
Oh, yes,
and
yes.
this taco lady laughs at us, and we're afraid that she's gonna call somebody. Uh, and so in that incident, there's a lot happening. One, and I think the main point is that the United States is not the only anti-immigrant country in the world. Mexico is a huge anti-immigrant country, and they're actually, the United States has outsourced their policies, and now it is even hard to get into Mexico from Guatemala. And for the longest time, there's a lot of xenophobia, and I don't know why, and I think it has to do with the history that after we gained independence from Spain, Mexico used to be one big country, all the way up from Oregon, all the way down to modern day Costa Rica. So that was an entire country. And slowly, the Central America, what later became Central America, fought for independence against Mexico. So that giant Mexico lasted for 5 years. And in 1821, the Central Americans parted ways. And I don't know. I think that anti-Central Americanness from the Mexicans' part comes from that.
Mm.
And to this day, that is still something that's going on. You know, Mexico has to be called out as well for how anti-Black, anti-Central American, anti-Indigenous they are as well. More people, more immigrants die within Mexico than they do at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that is statistics that the average American doesn't know. And things have to change as well. So all of that, I hope, was in that little scene. But I'm asking for a lot.
Well, I'm glad she brought it up then, so that you could explain it further. Did you ever find out what happened to Don Dago?
Don Dago, no. Well, he did try. I don't know. He is like I think if there's somebody that I'm still angry with, it would be him. He even tried to get money from my grandparents
Mhm.
as I was still trying to immigrate. So he goes back,
Oh,
and
wow.
then he never comes back to our hometown. So
Wow.
I don't know what happens after. Sometimes like we hear that he's in the States. I don't know. So he just disappears, and I don't know what happens. He had done this so many times with people that we knew in town, and he just decides to fuck up with a 9-year-old in tow.
Joanne has a good question. She said a close friend came from El Salvador with a 9 and 11-year-old to LA and Saskatoon, Canada. And she was telling her about your book, and she now wants to tell a few of them her story. And so she just wanted to know if there was anything she could do to help her friend, or if just listening to her story would be what you would suggest.
Um, so the friend is the immigrant,
Yes,
or they're both immigrants.
well, no, the friend immigrated with the two kids, and I guess
Okay,
that's Joanne's friend, yeah.
okay. I would just listen and suggest therapy, or suggest like an outlet.
Mhm.
After somebody shares a story, or if this person is beginning to share the story with you, you have to take care of them after, because whether they realize it or not, and especially if they've never told anybody the story, some things are gonna be there, you know, in the body. Sometimes there's like you shake, sometimes you sweat. So just figure a way to do something different outside of talking about trauma immediately after. That is like step one. And also hire, or like look for ways to hire a professional that could help your friend open up even more.
Thank you. Rachel has a question. She wants to know, during your second attempt, an amigo, potentially from Homeland Security, seemed to have brought you to safety. Did you ever learn who that was? And since it seemed like you might have been lost, do you know if you were in the US or in Mexico?
We were in Mexico. Oh, when they got us, we were in the US. But they returned us to Mexico. And this I also is interesting because you would think that he was doing something good.
Mm.
Now, that is exactly the wrong thing to do, and what Border Patrol agents are doing and putting immigrants in danger.
Mm.
Because at that time, the cartels weren't in control of immigration yet. So I was fortunate in that. But now agents are doing precisely that, but they're putting them sometimes in the hands of the wrong cartel. And then that cartel is going to do something bad to those people. So for us, it was something good because if they would have taken us, Chino and Patricia would probably have been in jail much longer. Um, I've asked friends who have been Border Patrol agents themselves, and their rationale is that that guy was just at the end of his shift and didn't want to do the paperwork.
Right.
Because if a Border Patrol agent gets you, that person is responsible for filling and like taking your fingerprints and doing everything. And in the stretch of desert, there are two Border Patrol stations, and one is in Nogales, and the other one's all the way in Yuma or Ajo, and we were directly in the middle. And from where we were, it would have been a 2-hour drive. So my friend Paco is like, he just didn't want to drive. He didn't want to deal with everything. So take his act of humanity with a grain of salt.
Right. I do want to ask you, we focus so much on the story, of course, but just about your own reading habits, and we often get into and ask authors about sort of if there's authors that that you like specifically, or any other stories that you recommend if we want to anybody wants to read further on the subject. If
Oh, on
there's
the
any
subject.
novels, yeah, on the and also what you like to read yourself. That's always fascinating.
Well, I'll start with the second one. I've never finished this because it always makes me write, by Tommy Orange, which is the highest compliment that I give a book. Like it has taken me so long, and it's helping me write what I want to write next. I also deeply admire this writer, also a poet turned memoirist. So those are the two. Around immigration, the Border Patrol agent that I just mentioned, or the ex-Border Patrol agent, is a dear friend and a beautiful writer. His name's Francisco Cantu, who wrote The Line Between the River, or Where the Line Becomes a River. The Line Becomes a River. And I recommend that book. Let's see. And Marcelo Castillo Hernandez, Children of the Land, is also a child immigrant from Mexico who wrote a memoir that came out in 2019. And that's it.
I'm just looking for these so they can pop them in the chat. There we go.
And the first one was Tommy Orange. There.
We know that one. Nice. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story with the world. It's really it takes a lot to do that. That's very courageous.
And the last book, I have another one called Brown Neon.
Say it again.
Neon. Brown Neon.
Okay.
By Raquel. Last name Gutierrez, right? Raquel Gutierrez. So yeah. Also about the border, Tucson and LA, and the landscape and queerness. It's amazing.
All right, I'm just trying to, oh, there's her name. Their name, I'm not sure. All right. Thank you so much. And we look forward to whatever comes next. And we are
me too.
yeah, major fans, and we appreciate everything. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, everybody, for
ciao.
joining.
Okay, bye-bye.